True peace, Kens, technicians, HVACs, peep the slang. Air conditioning is one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. It is also killing the 21st. Man, peep the slang. I'm HVAC certified too, so I'm in that field. Used to be in that field. Now I study project management and lead in AutoCAD, Windows, PowerPoint, all that other type of stuff. Man, peep the slang. When did indoor air become cold and clean? Air conditioning is one of those inventions that have become so ubiquitous that many in the development world don't even realize that less than a century ago it didn't exist. Indeed, it wasn't so long ago that the air inside our buildings and the air outside of them were one and the same. With occupants powerless against their environment, Eric Dean Wilson, in his published book after cooling on Freon, Global Warming and the Terrible Cost of Comfort. I have to get that book. Dives deep into the history of this field. It took more than just inventing the air conditioner to make people want to buy it. In fact, whole social classes outright rejected the technology for years. It took hustle, marketing skills, and mass societal change to place air conditioning at the center of our built environment. Man, Peter Slang Wilson covers that history, but he has a more ambiguous agenda to get us to see how our everyday comforts affect other people. Our choice of frigid cooling emits flagrant quantities of greenhouse gas emissions. Sound like some lead shit. Placing untold stress on our planet and civilization. Our pursuit of comfort ironically begets us more insecurity and ultimately less comfort. It is a provocative book, and TechCrunch hosted Wilson for a discussion earlier this week on a Twitter space. If you missed it, here are some selected highlights of our conversation. This interview has been condensed and edited. Granny Christian, the frame and story throughout the book is about your travels with your friend Sam, who works to collect Freon and destroy it. Why did you choose that narrative arc? Eric D. Wilson. Sam, at the time, was working for this green energy company, and they were trying to find a way to take on green projects that would turn a profit. They had found that they could do this by finding use Freon, specifically what's called CFC12. It's not made anymore, thank goodness, but it was responsible in part for partially destroying the ozone layer, and production of it was banned by the 90s. People's land. But use of it and buying and selling it on the secondary market is totally legal. This is sort of a loophole in the legality of this refrigerant because the United States and the United States government and the people who signed the Montreal Protocol throughout that when they stopped production of it, that it would pretty much get rid of Freon by the year 20,000, 2000, excuse me. Well, that didn't happen, which is kind of a mystery, man. Peter Slang. So Sam was driving around the United States finding Freon on the internet and meeting people, often people who are auto hobbyists or mechanics or something like that, who happen to have stockpile Freon. And he was buying it from them in order to destroy it for carbon credits on California's cap and trade system. And the interesting thing about this is that he was going to basically the 34 continuous states and meeting people that were often global warming deniers, who were often hostile to the idea of refrigerant being destroyed at all. So he often didn't tell them up front that he was destroying it. What was really interesting to me is that aside from a cast of colorful and strange characters, and sometimes violent characters actually as well, was the fact that sometimes after establishing a business relationship first, he was able to have really frank conversation about global warming with people who were otherwise not very open to it, in a time in which we're told that Americans are more divided than ever politically. We are that we're not speaking to each other across ideological divides. I thought this was a curious story, Christian. And when it comes to greenhouse gases, Freon is among the worst, right? Wilson, I should be really clear that the main global warming gases are carbon dioxide and methane, and some other ones as well. But molecule for molecule, CFCs, chlorofluoride carbons, are thousands of times greater at absorbing and retaining heat, meaning that they just thousands of times worse for global warming, molecule for molecule. So even though there's not that many of them in terms of parts per million in the atmosphere, there's enough to really make a sizable contribution to global warming. Man, Peter saying the irony is that the replacement of CFCs, HFCs, for the most part, don't really do anything to destroy the ozone layer, which is great, but they're also super global warming gases. So the ozone crisis was solved by replacing CFCs with refrigerant that exacerbated the global warming crisis. Christian, now to get to the heart of the book, you focus on the rise of air conditioning, but you start by giving readers a wide view of what life was like before its invention. Why you do that? Wilson, this was a surprise. I did not go into the book thinking that I was going to find this. Before air conditioning really took off in the home, there was a really different sense of what we would call personal comfort. And something that I really argue in the book is that we've come to think of it as personal comfort, and specifically thermal comfort has changed. What I argue in the book is that it is really part a cultural construction. Okay. Now I want to be really careful that people don't hear that I'm saying that it's entirely a construction. Yes, when we go too hot or too cold, then we can die for sure. But what's really interesting to me is that there's a lot of evidence to show that before air conditioning began at the beginning of the 20th century, people weren't really hungry for air conditioning. There was this greater sense that you could deal with the heat. I put that really carefully because I don't want to say that they suffered through it. Certainly, there were heat waves and summers that got too hot, but there was a real sense that you could manage the heat through analog ways, like sleeping outside, sleeping in parks, or designing buildings that incorporate passive cooling. The thing that really disturbed me was that through the 20th century, we really kind of forgot all that because we didn't need that knowledge anymore because we had air conditioning. So modernist architecture began to kind of ignore the outside conditions because you could construct whatever conditions you wanted inside. Man, peep the slang. I think the question that nobody really asked all along is this good for everyone? Should we have a homogenized standard of comfort? Nobody really asks that question. And there's a lot of people that find that the kind of American model of an office or American model of comfort is not comfortable, but in the United States and in other places, Christian, even beyond a homogenized standard, though you want readers to understand how comfort connects all of us together. Wilson, I think that one of the pernicious things about the American definition of comfort is that it has been denied as personal comfort. And the reason why I keep using that is because it is defined as individual comfort. And so, what would it mean to think about comfort as being always connected to somebody else, as more ethical that way? Because it's true. The truth is that our comfort is related to other people and vice versa. It's really asking us to think interdependently instead of independently, which is how we're often encouraged to think. And that's a huge, huge ask. Actually, that's a huge task and a huge paradigm shift. But I really think if we're really trying to think ecologically and not just sustainably, we have to think about how we're all connected and how these infrastructures and how they influence other people in other parts of the world. And Peter Slang, Climate Change book, summer 2021. Can the world really just fall apart? On how everything can collapse. A manual for our times by Pablo Servine and Raphael Stevens, translated from French by Andrew Brown. Bill Gates, often direction, not solutions, on how to avoid a climate disaster. The solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need by Bill Gates. Is the best way to solve climate change to do something, on how to do nothing, resisting the attention economy by Jenny Odell. How national security is being redefined by climate change, on all hell breaking loose. The Pentagon's perspective on climate change by Michael T. Clare. Air conditioning is one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. It's also killing the 21st. An interview with Eric Dean Wilson on his new book, After Cooling, on Freon, Global Warming, and the Terrible Cost of Comfort. Man, people slang. on the future of walls, or The Wall by John Lancaster. Christian air conditioning didn't take off right away. In fact, its inventors and customers really had to push hard to get people to want to use it. Wilson. Air conditioning really got its start in the early 20th century. In order to control the conditioning factories, I was surprised to find out that air conditioning was used in places to make things hotter or more humid, and slightly hotter in a place like a textile factory, where if it's not humid enough, cotton threads can break. Outside the factory, movie theaters were really the first time that thermal comfort was used as a commodity. There were all kinds of other commodifications of comfort, but this was really the first time that the public could go somewhere to feel cooler. And the funny thing is that most movie theaters in the mid 20s and 30s were freezing cold. They were not what I would call comfortable, because the people who were running them didn't really understand that air conditioning worked best when it is noticed least, which is a hard sell in the 20s, though it was a novelty, and that the way you caught people's attention on a summer day was to crank the AC up, which felt good for like 5 minutes, and then it was terribly uncomfortable, and you had to shiver through an hour and a half of the rest of the movie. Man, Peter Slang, Christian. I'm jumping ahead, but what does the future look like as a global warming persists and our cooling increases in line with that heat? Wilson. In so many cooling situations, there are major alternatives like redesigning our buildings so that they require way less energy and way less cooling. There are really amazing architects who are looking to things like termite mounds, because the colonies that they build sort of have brilliant engineer rooms with different temperatures. That said, I was surprised how much of our opinion on comfort could change by simply understanding that it could change. I think that we have to make the world of tomorrow desirable, and we can take a nod from the commercial advertising industry. We have to sell this future as one that we actually want, not as something that we're giving up. And I think the narrative is always like, oh, we have to stop doing this. We have to lower this. We have to give this up. And that's certainly true. But I think if we understand that as something we're giving up, but actually something that we're gaining, then it makes it a lot easier for people. It make it feel more possible. After cooling on Freon, global warming, and the terrible cost of comfort. Eric Dean. Yeah, Peter Slang. True peace.